Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other teachers at Lincoln High School. While her colleagues wore conservative blazers and carried worn leather bags filled with lesson plans, Sarah moved through the hallways with a quiet confidence that made students step aside without understanding why. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes, though professional, never quite hid the athletic build underneath. The truth was something Sarah rarely shared with anyone at the school. Before she became a mathematics teacher, she had served 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of the few women to complete the grueling training program. The transition from military service to education hadn't been easy, but Sarah believed in serving her country in different ways, and she saw teaching as another form of service. Lincoln High was located in a rough neighborhood where many teachers lasted less than a year. The school had a reputation for difficult students, overcrowded classrooms, and limited resources. When Sarah first applied for the position, the principal, Dr. Martinez, had been skeptical about hiring someone with no traditional teaching experience. However, her military background and genuine desire to help students had impressed him enough to give her a chance. Now, 3 years later, Sarah had earned respect from most of her students and colleagues. Her classroom was always orderly, not through fear but through the kind of quiet authority that came from someone who had faced real danger and survived. She never raised her voice, never threatened punishment, yet her students somehow knew that crossing certain lines would be unwise. Marcus Thompson was different from her other students. At 17, he stood 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds, most of it muscle from years of football and weightlifting. He had been held back twice and was older than his classmates, which gave him a natural position of dominance among the other students. Marcus had learned early that his size and aggressive attitude could get him what he wanted, and he used these tools liberally throughout the school. His home life provided little stability or guidance. His father had been in and out of prison for most of Marcus's life, and his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment. Without proper supervision or positive role models, Marcus had fallen in with a crowd that saw school as nothing more than a place to establish dominance and territory. For the first 2 years of high school, Marcus had coasted through classes, intimidating teachers and students alike. Most teachers simply passed him along rather than deal with the disruption he could cause. His reputation preceded him into every classroom, and many educators had already decided they would rather avoid confrontation than try to actually teach him. When Marcus first walked into Sarah's advanced algebra class at the beginning of the semester, he expected the same treatment he received everywhere else. He slouched into a seat in the back row, put his feet up on the desk, and waited for the new teacher to either ignore him or try to assert authority that he would then challenge. Sarah noticed him immediately. Of course, but her reaction was not what Marcus expected. She didn't stare him down or make an immediate issue of his posture. Instead, she simply began her lesson, moving around the classroom with easy confidence, engaging students with questions and practical examples. Her teaching style was unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. She didn't just lecture from the front of the room. She moved among the desks, making eye contact with each student, ensuring everyone understood before moving on to new concepts. For the first few days, Marcus tested small boundaries. He would mutter comments under his breath, tap his pencil loudly, or deliberately drop his books. Each time, Sarah would pause for just a moment, make brief eye contact with him, then continue teaching. She never called him out publicly, never embarrassed him in front of the class, but somehow Marcus began to feel that his usual tactics weren't working. Other students in the class noticed the dynamic too. They had heard stories about Marcus from previous years, about teachers who had quit mid-semester after dealing with his disruptions, about substitute teachers who refused to return after encountering him, but Ms. Mitchell seemed completely unfazed by his presence. The real test came during the 3rd week of class when Sarah assigned a group project. Marcus immediately announced that he wouldn't participate, expecting either to be excused from the assignment or to have other students do the work for him while he took credit. Instead, Sarah simply nodded and said, "That's your choice, Marcus. Your grade will reflect your level of participation." This straightforward response puzzled Marcus. He was used to teachers either backing down from their requirements or escalating to threats and confrontation. Sarah did neither. She simply stated a fact and moved on, leaving Marcus to make his own decisions about the consequences he was willing to accept. As the weeks progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Marcus found himself actually listening during Sarah's lessons. Her teaching methods were different from what he was used to. She related mathematical concepts to real-world situations, showing how algebra could be used in construction, business, and even sports statistics. For someone who had always struggled academically, these practical applications made the subject matter more accessible. Sarah also began to notice small changes in Marcus's behavior. He still sat in the back row, but he no longer put his feet on the desk. His muttered comments became less frequent, and occasionally she caught him taking notes. She didn't make a big deal of these improvements, understanding instinctively that drawing attention to them might cause Marcus to revert to his old patterns. The other students in the class were watching this slow transformation with amazement. Marcus Thompson, the student who had terrorized teachers and classmates for years, was actually participating in class discussions. His answers were often wrong, but Sarah never mocked or dismissed his efforts. Instead, she would guide him toward the correct solution, treating his mistakes as learning opportunities rather than failures. However, change is rarely linear, especially for someone with Marcus's history of using aggression to solve problems. The fragile progress he had been making was about to face its biggest test, and neither Marcus nor Sarah could have predicted how dramatically their classroom dynamic was about to shift. The incident that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in November. Marcus had arrived at school already agitated, having gotten into an argument with his mother about his grades the night before. She had threatened to take away his car privileges if he didn't start showing improvement in his classes. And this threat felt like an attack on the one thing that gave him status among his peers. His first period class hadn't gone well either. Mr. Rodriguez, his English teacher, had returned a failing grade on an essay that Marcus had actually tried to write. The feedback was harsh and dismissive, with red ink covering most of the page. Marcus felt humiliated, especially since several classmates had seen the grade when the papers were handed back. By the time he reached Sarah's algebra class, Marcus was looking for a target for his frustration. The careful progress he had been making over the past several weeks felt meaningless in the face of his mounting anger about his academic struggles and home situation. Sarah began the class as usual, writing a complex equation on the whiteboard and asking students to work through it in pairs. She had learned that collaborative learning helped many of her students understand difficult concepts better than traditional lecturing. As students paired up and began working, she moved around the room offering guidance and answering questions. When she approached Marcus's desk, she noticed immediately that he hadn't even taken out his notebook. His body language was tense and he was staring at the desk with barely controlled rage. Sarah had seen this kind of anger before during her military service. She recognized the signs of someone who was looking for a fight, someone whose frustration had reached a boiling point. "Marcus," she said quietly, crouching down to his eye level so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by other students. "Would you like to work through this problem together?" The offer, meant as a kindness, felt like condescension to Marcus in his current state. All the progress he had made, all the small steps toward academic engagement, seemed to crumble in that moment. The rage that had been building throughout the morning finally found its target. "I don't need your help," he snapped, his voice loud enough that other students looked up from their work. "I don't need this stupid class, and I don't need you pretending to care about whether I learn this garbage." Sarah remained calm, still crouched beside his desk. Her military training had taught her to de-escalate tense situations, and she could see that Marcus was dealing with more than just academic frustration. "You're right that you don't need my help if you don't want it," she said evenly. "But the offer stands if you change your mind." This reasonable response only fueled Marcus's anger further. He was accustomed to teachers either backing down completely or escalating to match his aggression. Sarah's calm demeanor felt like she wasn't taking him seriously, wasn't recognizing the threat he represented. "Don't talk to me like I'm some little kid," Marcus said, his voice rising. The classroom had gone completely quiet now, with all 28 students watching the confrontation unfold. "You think you're so smart with your perfect little classroom and your perfect little lessons? You don't know anything about me or what I'm dealing with." Sarah straightened up slowly, maintaining eye contact with Marcus but keeping her posture non-threatening. She could feel the tension in the room, could sense that this moment was crucial not just for Marcus but for every other student watching. How she handled this situation would determine whether her classroom remained a safe learning environment or became just another place where aggression ruled. "You're absolutely right," Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent classroom. "I don't know what you're dealing with outside this room, but while you're here, I'm going to continue treating you with respect and expecting the same in return." The word respect triggered something in Marcus that even he didn't fully understand. Throughout his life, respect had been something he demanded through intimidation and size. The idea that someone might give it freely without fear was foreign to him. In his frustrated state, it felt like mockery. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. At his full height, he towered over Sarah by nearly 8 inches and outweighed her by at least 70 pounds. Several students in the front row instinctively scooted their desks back, creating more space around the confrontation. "Respect?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You want to talk about respect? You stand there acting all calm and superior, like you're better than everyone else, like you're not scared of me." Sarah's military instincts were fully engaged now, though she kept her external demeanor calm. She could read Marcus's body language, could see the way his hands were clenching and unclenching, the way his weight was shifting from foot to foot. These were the signs of someone preparing for physical action, someone whose rational mind was being overruled by emotion and adrenaline. "I'm not scared of you, Marcus," Sarah said simply, and the truth of that statement was evident in every aspect of her bearing. "But I am concerned about you. This anger you're carrying isn't going to help you solve whatever problems you're facing." The classroom felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Some students were reaching for their phones, ready to record whatever happened next or call for help. Others were calculating the distance to the door, wondering if they should leave before the situation escalated further. Marcus took a step closer to Sarah, using his height advantage to loom over her in a way that had intimidated countless teachers before her. His face was flushed with anger, his breathing had become rapid and shallow, and his hands were shaking slightly with the effort of restraining himself. "You think you know everything," he said, his voice now barely controlled. "You think you can just waltz in here with your fancy degree and fix everyone's problems. Well, let me tell you something, lady. You don't know anything about the real world." Sarah remained perfectly still, neither backing away nor advancing. Her years of training had taught her to read volatile situations, to recognize when someone was moving past the point of verbal confrontation toward physical action. Marcus was approaching that line rapidly, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. The next few seconds would determine not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but the entire trajectory of both their lives. The moment that would change everything happened in the space of a single heartbeat. Marcus, his rational mind completely overwhelmed by weeks of accumulated frustration, made a decision that crossed every line of acceptable behavior. His right hand, which had been clenched in a fist at his side, suddenly swung upward in a backhanded motion aimed directly at Sarah's face. To any observer in the classroom, what happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, though the entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Sarah's reaction was so swift and precise that several students later claimed they hadn't even seen her move. Her years of SEAL training had programmed responses so deeply into her muscle memory that her body reacted before her conscious mind fully processed the threat. As Marcus's hand approached her face, Sarah's left hand shot up with lightning speed, intercepting his wrist mid-swing. Her grip was iron strong, stopping his momentum completely. Simultaneously, her right hand moved to his elbow, applying pressure to a specific nerve point that immediately sent shooting pain down his arm and caused his hand to open involuntarily. But Sarah wasn't finished. In one fluid motion, she stepped slightly to her left while maintaining her grip on Marcus's wrist, using his own forward momentum and her leverage to guide him face first toward the whiteboard. The movement was so smooth and controlled that Marcus found himself pressed against the board before he even understood what had happened. Sarah applied just enough pressure to keep Marcus immobilized without causing permanent damage. Her forearm was pressed against the back of his neck, pinning him to the board, while her other hand maintained control of his arm in a position that made resistance both painful and futile. Marcus, who had never in his life been physically dominated by anyone, found himself completely helpless against someone nearly a foot, shorter and 70 pounds lighter than him. The classroom was dead silent except for Marcus's labored breathing and the sound of his face pressed against the whiteboard. Every student sat frozen in their seats, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The boy who had terrorized teachers and students for years had been neutralized in seconds by their quiet math teacher. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, was calm and steady, with no trace of exertion despite having just executed a perfect defensive maneuver. "Marcus," she said, her mouth close to his ear so only he could hear her words. "You just made a very serious mistake. Striking a teacher is assault, and I could have you arrested right now. More importantly, you just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Marcus tried to struggle against her hold, but every movement only increased his discomfort. Sarah's technique was flawless, applying pressure in ways that made resistance counterproductive. He had never experienced anything like this level of physical control, and the shock of it was almost as overwhelming as the physical restraint itself. "However," Sarah continued, her voice still calm and measured, "I'm going to give you one chance to make this right. I'm going to let you go, and you're going to sit down, calm yourself, and we're going to finish this class period like civilized people. After class, you and I are going to have a conversation about what just happened and what comes next. Do you understand me?" Marcus managed a grunt that Sarah interpreted as agreement. She maintained her hold for another few seconds, making sure he understood that she was releasing him by choice, not because she had to. Then, as smoothly as she had applied the restraint, she released him and stepped back, giving him space to turn around and face the class. Marcus turned slowly, his face flushed with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something he had rarely experienced in his life: genuine fear. Every student in the classroom was staring at him, but not with the mixture of admiration and terror he was used to inspiring. Instead, he saw shock, amazement, and in some faces, something that might have been relief. For several long moments, Marcus stood facing the class, clearly struggling with how to respond to what had just happened. His entire identity was built around being the biggest, strongest, most intimidating person in any room. In less than 3 seconds, Sarah had shattered that identity completely. Sarah, meanwhile, had returned to her position at the front of the classroom, as if nothing unusual had occurred. She picked up her marker and turned to face the class with the same calm professionalism she always displayed. "Now then," she said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, "let's continue with today's lesson. Can someone tell me how we might approach solving this equation?" The normalcy of her tone was perhaps more shocking to the students than the physical confrontation had been. She was acting as if she hadn't just demonstrated combat skills that none of them had imagined she possessed. Several students glanced nervously between Sarah and Marcus, unsure how to respond to her invitation to continue with the lesson. Marcus slowly walked back to his desk, moving carefully as if testing whether his body still worked properly. The pain in his arm was already fading, but the psychological impact of what had happened was only beginning to sink in. He had just learned that his primary tool for dealing with conflict, physical intimidation, was completely ineffective against this woman. Worse than ineffective, it had been turned against him with embarrassing ease. As he sat down, Marcus's mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. Every student in the class had seen him dominated physically by someone he had assumed would be helpless against him. Word of this incident would spread throughout the school within hours. His reputation, carefully built over years of successful intimidation, was now in ruins. But perhaps more disturbing to Marcus was the realization that Sarah had shown restraint, even in the moment of defending herself. She could have hurt him much worse than she did. He was certain of that now. The fact that she had used just enough force to neutralize him without causing serious injury suggested a level of training and self-control that Marcus was only beginning to comprehend. Sarah continued with her lesson, calling on students and working through problems as if the dramatic confrontation had never occurred. Gradually, the other students began to respond, though their voices were subdued and they kept glancing at Marcus to gauge his reaction. Marcus himself sat in stunned silence, staring at his desk and trying to process what had just happened to him. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. All of his usual responses seemed inadequate to this new situation he found himself in. The remaining 30 minutes of class passed in an atmosphere unlike anything Lincoln High School had ever experienced. Sarah continued teaching with remarkable composure, working through algebraic equations and engaging students in problem-solving exercises. Yet everyone in the room was acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of their classroom. Marcus sat motionless at his desk, his usual swagger completely absent. The physical restraint Sarah had used was unlike anything he had experienced before. It wasn't the brutal, overwhelming force he might have expected from a street fight, or even from the police officers who had arrested some of his friends. Instead, it had been precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. The realization that she could have seriously injured him but chose not to was perhaps more unsettling than the physical dominance itself. Other students began to participate more freely in the lesson than they had all semester. Without Marcus's intimidating presence dominating the classroom atmosphere, quieter students found their voices. Jessica Martinez, who had barely spoken above a whisper in previous classes, actually volunteered to work a problem on the board. Tommy Chen, who usually kept his head down to avoid drawing Marcus's attention, began asking thoughtful questions about the mathematical concepts. Sarah noticed these changes immediately and adapted her teaching accordingly. She encouraged the increased participation while remaining aware of Marcus's emotional state. Her peripheral vision kept him in constant view, not because she feared another physical confrontation. Her training assured her she could handle that, but because she understood that this moment represented a crucial turning point for him. As the class period neared its end, Sarah began assigning homework for the next day. She moved through the classroom, placing assignment sheets on each desk, treating every student with the same professional courtesy she always maintained. When she reached Marcus's desk, she set down his assignment sheet and said quietly, "Please stay after class. We need to talk." Marcus nodded without looking up, his throat too tight to speak. The weight of what had happened was settling on him like a heavy blanket, making it difficult to breathe properly. He had built his entire high school identity around being someone others feared, someone who could impose his will through physical dominance. In 3 seconds, Sarah had demonstrated that his most fundamental assumption about himself was false. When the bell rang, students filed out of the classroom with unusual quiet. Normally, the end of a class period brought an explosion of conversation and activity. But today the students left whispering among themselves, their voices subdued by what they had witnessed. Several students glanced back at Marcus as they left, but their expressions had changed from the fearful respect he was accustomed to receiving to something more complex, perhaps pity, perhaps curiosity about what would happen next. Within moments, the classroom was empty except for Sarah and Marcus. Sarah moved to her desk and sat down, then gestured to a chair positioned directly across from her. "Come sit down, Marcus. We need to have an honest conversation." Marcus rose slowly from his desk and walked to the indicated chair. Up close, he could see that Sarah's calm demeanor wasn't an act. Her breathing was steady, her hands weren't shaking, and her eyes held no trace of fear or uncertainty. This wasn't someone who had barely survived a dangerous encounter. This was someone who had handled a routine situation with professional competence. "First," Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to address what just happened. You attempted to strike a teacher, which is assault under state law. I could call the police right now and have you arrested. More immediately, I could report this to Principal Martinez and have you expelled. Do you understand the seriousness of what you did?" Marcus nodded, still unable to meet her eyes directly. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate through his emotional turmoil. He could be facing criminal charges, expulsion, and the complete destruction of any chance he had for finishing high school or moving on to any kind of productive future. "However," Sarah continued, "I'm not going to do either of those things unless you force me to. What I am going to do is tell you something about myself that I don't share with many people, because I think understanding who I am might help you understand what just happened and what needs to happen next." Marcus looked up at her for the first time since the incident, confusion evident on his face. Sarah leaned back in her chair slightly, maintaining eye contact while keeping her posture open and non-threatening. "Before I became a teacher, I served 8 years in the United States Navy as a SEAL. Do you know what that means, Marcus?" Marcus's eyes widened slightly. Even someone with his limited knowledge of military service knew that Navy SEALs represented the elite of American Special Forces. Stories and movies had made their reputation for lethal effectiveness legendary, though Marcus had never imagined he would encounter one in a high school mathematics classroom. "It means," Sarah continued, "that I spent years learning how to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. More importantly, It means I learned how to assess situations accurately and respond with appropriate force. When you swung at me, my training kicked in automatically. I used exactly enough force to stop you without causing permanent damage because that's what the situation required. Marcus's mind was reeling. The quiet math teacher who had been patiently helping him with algebraic equations was a trained special forces operator. The woman who had never raised her voice or made a threat was someone whose job had once been eliminating enemies of the United States. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "Now," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious, "we need to talk about why you did what you did and what's going to happen next. Because Marcus, what occurred today can't happen again. Not ever. Do you understand me?" Marcus nodded quickly, finally finding his voice. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'm sorry. I don't know why I did that. I was angry about other stuff and I lost control." Sarah studied his face carefully, using skills developed over years of interrogating prisoners and assessing threats to determine whether his contrition was genuine. What she saw convinced her that his regret was real, even if his understanding of the situation was still incomplete. "Anger is understandable, Marcus. Everyone gets angry. But you're 17 years old and you weigh over 200 pounds. When someone your size loses control, people get hurt. Today you got lucky that the person you chose to attack was trained to handle that situation. Next time you might hurt someone badly, and then you'll spend years in prison regretting a few seconds of poor judgment." The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a cold blanket. For the first time, he was beginning to understand that his pattern of using size and aggression to solve problems wasn't just ineffective, it was dangerous for everyone involved, including himself. Sarah reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a bottled water, offering it to Marcus. His hands were shaking slightly as he accepted it, and she could see that the full impact of what had occurred was finally hitting him. The adrenaline that had fueled his earlier aggression was wearing off, leaving him feeling drained and vulnerable. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice taking on a gentler tone, "I want you to tell me what's really going on. The anger you showed today didn't come from nowhere. Something's been building up inside you, and it finally exploded in my classroom. Help me understand what you're dealing with." For several long moments, Marcus sat silently, staring at the water bottle in his hands. No teacher had ever asked him this kind of question before. Most had either ignored his behavior or responded to it with punishment and threats. The idea that someone might actually want to understand the source of his anger was foreign to him. "Everything's messed up," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mom's always working, and when she's home she's either yelling at me about grades or passed out on the couch from exhaustion. My dad, he's been in prison for 2 years now and I don't even know when he's getting out. All my friends dropped out or got arrested, and I'm stuck here pretending like I care about algebra when I don't even know if I'll graduate." Sarah listened without interrupting, recognizing that Marcus was sharing more honest emotion than he had probably expressed to anyone in years. She could see the pain beneath his anger, the fear and uncertainty that he had been masking with aggression and bravado. "School's always been hard for me," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he found the courage to continue. "I'm not smart like these other kids. I try to do the work, but it doesn't make sense, and then I get frustrated and angry, and everyone thinks I'm just some thug who doesn't care about anything." "But you do care," Sarah observed. "You wouldn't be frustrated about struggling academically if you didn't care about learning, and you wouldn't be angry about your family situation if you didn't care about having stability and support." Marcus looked up at her with surprise. No one had ever suggested that his anger might be connected to caring about things rather than not caring. The reframe was so unexpected that it took him several seconds to process what she had said. "The thing is, Marcus, caring about things and not knowing how to fix them can be incredibly frustrating, but using anger and aggression to deal with that frustration never actually solves the underlying problems. It just creates new ones." Sarah stood up and moved to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "Let me show you something that might help you understand what I mean." She drew a simple diagram showing a cycle with arrows connecting different stages. "This is called a feedback loop. Your academic struggles make you frustrated. Your frustration makes you angry. Your anger gets you in trouble, which makes you fall further behind academically, which increases your frustration. See the pattern?" Marcus studied the diagram, and for the first time he began to see his behavior as part of a larger pattern, rather than just isolated incidents of losing his temper. The visual representation made the connection clear in a way that spoken explanations hadn't. The good news, Sarah continued, is that feedback loops can be changed, but it requires breaking the cycle at one of the connection points, and that's where you have some choices to make. She turned back to face him directly. Here's what I'm prepared to offer you, but only if you're genuinely committed to making changes. First, I won't report today's incident to the administration or the police, provided it never happens again. Second, I'm willing to work with you after school to help you catch up on the mathematical concepts you've missed over the years. Third, I can connect you with some resources that might help with your family situation. Marcus felt a surge of hope that he hadn't experienced in months. The idea that someone was willing to help him rather than just punish him was almost overwhelming. But Sarah wasn't finished. However, she continued, her tone becoming more serious, these offers come with non-negotiable conditions. Any hint of aggressive behavior toward me, another teacher, or any student, and our agreement is over. I'll report everything to the authorities and you'll face the full consequences of your actions. Additionally, you'll need to apologize to every student who witnessed today's incident and demonstrate, through your behavior, that you're committed to change. The mention of apologizing to his classmates made Marcus's stomach clench with anxiety. His reputation had been built on never showing weakness or vulnerability. Admitting that he had been wrong would be humiliating in a way that the physical restraint hadn't been. Sarah noticed his reaction immediately. I know that feels impossible right now. Apologizing means admitting you made mistakes, and that can feel like giving up power. But real strength, Marcus, comes from being able to acknowledge when you're wrong and take steps to make things right. What happened today took no strength at all. It was just a scared, frustrated young man lashing out because he didn't know what else to do. Her words stung because they contained an uncomfortable truth. Marcus had never thought of his aggressive behavior as weakness before, but Sarah's perspective forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about strength and power. I want to help you, Marcus, but I can't want your success more than you do. You have to decide right now whether you're ready to do the hard work of changing, or whether you want to continue down the path you're on, because I can tell you from experience that the path you're on leads nowhere good. Marcus sat in silence for nearly a full minute, wrestling with the most important decision of his young life. Everything Sarah was offering represented hope for a different future, but accepting her help would require him to give up the identity he had built for himself over years. It would mean admitting that his way of handling problems had been wrong, and that he needed help to change. Finally, he looked up at Sarah with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. What do I have to do? Sarah smiled for the first time since the incident occurred, and Marcus was surprised to see genuine warmth in her expression. The first thing we're going to do is create a plan. Real change doesn't happen overnight, and it requires structure and accountability. Are you ready to start? Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. For years he had seen asking for help as a sign of weakness. But sitting in Sarah's classroom, he was beginning to understand that it might actually take more courage than continuing to handle everything alone. Sarah pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and placed it between them on the desk. Let's start with your immediate concerns. You mentioned that you're struggling academically and don't know if you'll graduate. What specific subjects are giving you the most trouble? Everything except PE, Marcus admitted with a bitter laugh. But math and English are the worst. I'm failing both of them and I need to pass them to graduate. I've been trying to avoid thinking about it because it just makes me angry, but I know I'm running out of time. Sarah wrote academic recovery at the top of the paper and began making notes underneath. Okay, those are problems we can solve. It'll take work, but they're absolutely solvable. I can help you with mathematics after school, and I know Ms. Rodriguez would be willing to work with you on English if you approach her the right way. Marcus looked skeptical. Ms. Rodriguez hates me. She gave me an F on my last essay and wrote all kinds of mean comments all over it. Ms. Rodriguez doesn't hate you, Marcus, but she's frustrated with you, just like you're frustrated with the material. Teachers are human beings too, and when we see a student with potential not trying, it's discouraging for us. Sarah paused and looked at him directly. When was the last time you actually tried on an assignment in her class? Marcus thought for a moment, then looked down at his hands. I don't know. Maybe freshman year? I got tired of getting bad grades even when I tried, so I just stopped trying. It hurt less to fail because I didn't care than to fail when I was actually trying my best. Sarah nodded with understanding. That makes perfect sense, actually. It's a natural defense mechanism. But here's what I learned during my military training. Avoiding pain in the short term usually creates much more pain in the long term. The temporary discomfort of struggling through difficult material is nothing compared to the long-term consequences of giving up entirely. She continued writing on their plan. Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow you're going to stay after my class for tutoring. We'll work on catching you up on the fundamental concepts you've missed, starting from the beginning if necessary. There's no shame in going back to basics. Even Navy SEALs start with basic training before they learn advanced techniques. Marcus felt a flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. The idea of additional schoolwork felt overwhelming, but Sarah's confidence that he could succeed was infectious. What about Ms. Rodriguez? How do I fix things with her? You're going to write her a letter, Sarah said, making another note on their plan. Not an assignment, just an honest letter explaining that you want to start over and asking for her help. Teachers respond well to students who take responsibility for their actions and genuinely want to improve. The next item Sarah wrote surprised Marcus. Anger management strategies? She looked up at him seriously. Marcus, what happened today can't happen again, ever. We need to develop some tools you can use when you feel that kind of rage building up. I don't usually get that angry, Marcus protested. Today was just, everything was going wrong and I couldn't handle it anymore. That's exactly why we need strategies, Sarah replied. The most dangerous moments are when multiple stressors pile up at once. I'm going to teach you some techniques that military personnel use to stay calm under pressure. They're not complicated, but they require practice. She demonstrated a breathing technique showing Marcus how to slow his heart rate and clear his mind when anger threatened to overwhelm his judgment. The key is recognizing the warning signs before you reach the point of no return. Your body gives you signals: increased heart rate, tense muscles, shallow breathing. If you learn to notice these signs early, you can use techniques like this to regain control. Marcus practiced the breathing exercise, surprised to find that it actually did help him feel more centered and calm. The idea that he could have some control over his emotional responses was revolutionary to someone who had always felt at the mercy of his anger. Now, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious, we need to address the hardest part of this plan. Tomorrow, before class begins, you're going to apologize to every student who witnessed today's incident. You're going to take full responsibility for your actions, and you're going to assure them that it won't happen again. Marcus's stomach clenched at the thought. Ms. Mitchell, I don't know if I can do that. Everyone's going to think I'm weak. They'll lose all respect for me. Sarah shook her head firmly. Marcus, respect that's based on fear isn't real respect. It's just submission. Real respect is earned through consistency, integrity, and treating others well. The students in that classroom weren't respecting you today. They were afraid of you. There's a huge difference. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. In the military, the leaders who commanded the most genuine respect were the ones who could admit when they made mistakes and take steps to correct them. Soldiers will follow someone like that anywhere. But leaders who never acknowledged their errors and blamed everyone else for problems? Those leaders got people killed because their subordinates stopped trusting their judgment. Marcus considered this perspective. He had never thought about the difference between fear and respect before, but Sarah's explanation made sense. The other students in class today hadn't looked at him with admiration after he tried to hit their teacher. They had looked at him with shock and disappointment. What if they don't forgive me? Marcus asked quietly. What if I apologize and they just think it's fake or stupid? Some of them might think that, Sarah admitted honestly. Change is hard, and people are often skeptical when someone who has behaved badly suddenly wants to be different. But that's not your concern, Marcus. Your job is to take responsibility for your actions and demonstrate through your behavior that you're committed to being better. What other people think about that is their business. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where students were getting into cars and buses to head home. I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. Half the students in this class are actually hoping you succeed. They're tired of being afraid in school, tired of walking on eggshells around you. If you genuinely change, if you become someone who contributes positively to the classroom environment instead of dominating it through intimidation, they'll be relieved and grateful. She turned back to face Marcus. The other half will be skeptical, and that's understandable too. You'll have to prove yourself to them through consistent good behavior over time. But Marcus, Even the students who are skeptical right now will eventually come around if you stick with this commitment. Marcus looked at the plan Sarah had written, studying each item carefully: academic tutoring, anger management, apologies, letter to Ms. Rodriguez. It all seemed overwhelming, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a clear path forward instead of just drifting from one crisis to the next. "Ms. Mitchell," he said finally, "why are you doing this for me? After what I did today, you could have just gotten rid of me. Why take the risk of trying to help me?" Sarah smiled and returned to her seat across from him. "Because I believe in second chances, Marcus. And because I see potential in you that I don't think you see in yourself yet. You're intelligent, you're strong, and when you're not consumed by anger, you actually care about other people. Those are good qualities to build on." 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood at the front of Lincoln High School's auditorium, wearing a cap and gown and holding his diploma. The transformation that had begun in Sarah's classroom that November day had been neither quick nor easy, but it had been genuine and lasting. The apologies he had made to his classmates the day after the incident had been awkward and painful, but they had also been the first step toward rebuilding his relationships with his peers. Some students had been skeptical at first, waiting to see if his changed behavior would last beyond a few days. Others had been more immediately forgiving, grateful to see him taking responsibility for his actions. The daily tutoring sessions with Sarah had revealed something that surprised both of them. Marcus was actually quite gifted at mathematics when he wasn't consumed by anger and frustration. His struggles hadn't been due to lack of ability, but rather to accumulated gaps in his foundational knowledge and his own belief that he was incapable of academic success. Once those barriers were addressed, his progress had been remarkable. The letter he had written to Ms. Rodriguez had led to a difficult but productive conversation about starting over. She had been willing to give him another chance, and Marcus had discovered that English, like mathematics, became much more manageable when he approached it with genuine effort rather than defensive hostility. His writing skills improved dramatically once he stopped seeing assignments as personal attacks and started viewing them as opportunities to communicate his thoughts clearly. Perhaps more importantly, the anger management techniques Sarah had taught him proved invaluable in situations far beyond the classroom. When his father was released from prison 3 months after the incident and immediately began creating chaos in their family life again, Marcus found himself able to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Instead of getting into screaming matches that solved nothing, he learned to set boundaries and remove himself from volatile situations. His relationship with his mother had also improved significantly. As his grades rose and his behavior problems disappeared, she began to trust him with more responsibility and independence. For the first time in years, their conversations focused on his future plans and aspirations rather than just managing his latest crisis. The other students at Lincoln High gradually began to see Marcus differently as well. Without his intimidating presence dominating social interactions, quieter students found their voices. Jessica Martinez, who had barely spoken in class before the incident, became one of Marcus's study partners and eventually a close friend. Tommy Chen started a chess club that Marcus joined, discovering a love for strategic thinking that complemented his improving academic performance. Marcus's reputation throughout the school evolved from feared bully to respected peer. Younger students who had once crossed hallways to avoid him began approaching him for advice and mentorship. He found that he enjoyed helping others navigate challenges that he himself had faced, and several teachers began referring struggling students to him for peer tutoring and support. Sarah continued to be a steady presence in Marcus's life throughout his transformation. Their after-school tutoring sessions had evolved into broader mentoring conversations about goal setting, decision-making, and planning for the future. She helped him research colleges with strong mathematics programs and guided him through the application process. When acceptance letters began arriving in the spring, Marcus's excitement was matched only by his gratitude to the teacher who had seen potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself. He had been accepted to 3 different state universities, each offering partial scholarships based on his improved academic performance and compelling personal statement about overcoming adversity. Now, as he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Marcus could see Sarah in the audience applauding with obvious pride. Principal Martinez, who had been prepared to expel Marcus after hearing rumors about the classroom incident 6 months earlier, Instead, shook his hand warmly and congratulated him on his remarkable turnaround. Marcus's mother was there too, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son achieve something that had seemed impossible just months before. Even his father, despite his many flaws, had made the effort to attend the ceremony and express pride in Marcus's accomplishments. After the ceremony, as families gathered outside for photos and celebrations, Marcus found Sarah standing near her car in the parking lot. She was alone, having no family of her own at the school, but she looked content as she watched the joyful chaos of graduation day. "Ms. Mitchell," Marcus called out as he approached her, still wearing his cap and gown. "I wanted to thank you again." "I know I've said it before, but I don't think you really understand how much you changed my life." Sarah smiled and shook her head. "Marcus, I didn't change your life. You did that. All I did was provide some guidance and support when you were ready to accept it. The hard work, the daily decisions to do better, the courage to apologize and change, that all came from you." Marcus thought about her words for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe, but I never would have found that courage without someone believing in me first. You could have had me arrested that day or expelled or just written me off as another problem student. Instead, you saw something in me that I didn't even know was there." "What I saw," Sarah replied, "was a young man who was angry and frustrated but not genuinely malicious, someone who had gotten into bad patterns but wasn't fundamentally bad himself. The potential was always there, Marcus. You just needed help recognizing it and developing it." Marcus pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Sarah. "I wanted you to have this. It's a copy of my acceptance letter to State University. I start in the fall majoring in mathematics education." Sarah opened the envelope and read the letter, her smile growing wider. "You're planning to become a teacher? I want to help kids who are struggling the way I was struggling. Kids who think they're too dumb to learn or too angry to change or too far behind to catch up. I want to show them that none of those things are true. The same way you showed me." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the full impact of what had started as a defensive reaction to an aggressive student. Not only had Marcus transformed his own life, but he was now committed to helping others make similar transformations. The ripple effects of that November morning would extend far beyond anything she could have imagined. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," she said simply, "and I know you're going to be an excellent teacher someday." As Marcus walked back toward his family and friends, Sarah reflected on the lesson she had learned as much as taught over the past 6 months. Sometimes the students who seem the most hopeless are actually the ones with the greatest potential for positive change. Sometimes the moment that appears most dangerous and destructive can become the catalyst for remarkable growth and transformation. Marcus Thompson had entered her classroom as a bully, whose future seemed predetermined by his worst impulses. He was leaving it as a young man with unlimited possibilities, armed with the knowledge that he could overcome any obstacle through hard work, support from others, and the courage to keep trying even when things seemed impossible. The incident that had lasted 3 seconds had created changes that would last a lifetime, not just for Marcus, but for all the students he would eventually teach and inspire. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most important battles are won not through superior force but through the decision to fight for someone's potential rather than against their problems.